Okay, so now let's try to restore the database on 1S instance. Let's go to the C drive, and in the C drive we have new folders. In this, let's try to restore the backup file first. Okay, and we have to restore it in the restoring mode, in the no recovery mode. So hit on restore. This is restore, and if we go on to the database on 1S instance, it should be in restoring mode. Now let's try to restore it transaction file once. Restore transactional log from device. Go to the same new folder into the C drive, and select the trn file. Hit OK. OK. Options. Restore with no recovery. Click on OK. So now our database has been restored and it's in the current state what we have on the primary instance. Now it's time to create an always on. So for creating an always on, the first step is to create first the always on object, as we created a cluster computer object. So go to the Active Directory users and computers in the computer section, AWS AON SQL. This is the name that we will give to our always on cluster. Click on OK, and this is created. As before, this time also we have to grant permissions. So go to the security and add SQL Server 1P, objects computer. Okay, full control, SQL Server 1S, full control, and we also have to give permission to our cluster AWS AON cluster, and we have to grant full permission. And the account that we are using is same AWS AON, so we don't have to grant permission. Create this object and disable this object as we have done for AWS cluster. But now if I refresh it, AWS cluster should be enabled. Yes, see, it's enabled, and description is also mentioned that failover cluster for virtual network. So once we configure the AWS always on, SQL Server always on, then this object will also get enabled. So this object is created. Now let's try to create the always on. And one more thing we have to do, actually we have to create two secondary IPs on this server so that always on can connect. So let me show you. So new availability group wizard, click on next. Availability group name is AWS AON SQL. AWS when meet the prerequisite, there is only one database that meets the prerequisite. We have actually only one database, and we have to connect to our 1S instance. And here are a few options that we can configure: automatic mode, synchronous commit, and readable secondary, no, and automatic failover to 1P. Actually we can configure, I think we can use readable, so we can test our database without a failover. Automatic failover up to 5 endpoints. So these are the endpoints that are automatically created on the servers. The endpoint port on which always on listen is 5022. Actually 5022 is also used by SQL Server mirroring, and As we know, as per the SQL documents, Microsoft documents, AWS always on is a higher version of AWS mirroring. Backup preference. Backup preference is the preference that is given to the uh, node. If we have primary server up and running and production is connected with the primary database, primary always on instance, then we mostly take the backup from the secondary instance. So it's preferred secondary. Listener. On this part, we have to configure the IP address. So let's hit next. So automatic seeding here, if we have not taken the backup and restore it on the secondary instance, we can do it by this always on console, but we have already done it. So we can click on join only option and skip the initial data sync. So I will click on create. So this will configure the always on for us, but it will not configure the endpoints. We don't have to do the full backup, restore the full backup, backing up, log backup, restoring the log backup, joining it. Joining AWS A1 to availability group, AWS AON SQL on SQL Server 1S is in progress. So once this step is done, then we are good. Our always on is set up, but we don't have the IP address. So what we can do is we can create two secondary IP addresses on one secondary IP address on 1P server and one secondary IP address on 1S address. So both the subnets will be there, and then we can add both the IP addresses. Let's wait for this step to complete.